So back here in new expense, let's make sure that we store the data entered by the user, and we then also use that data when the form is submitted. So when this input field is submitted in the end. And for that, of course, we'll also need a button that allows us to submit this. Now, first things first, I want to start with storing the value entered by the user. And when it comes to storing that value, we got two main approaches for doing that. The first approach is to add another parameter to the text field, and that would be the onChanged parameter, which allows us to register a function that will be triggered whenever the value in that text field changes. For example, because the user pressed a key. And onChange wants a function that will receive a string value, and that string value that's received will be the value entered into the text field. So therefore, we could add a method here to new expense state, a method that returns nothing and could be called underscore save title input. And here we get our input value, which is of type string, as mentioned before. And now we can pass save title input as a value to onChanged. Like this, not executing it, just pointing at it. With that, we have to remove const though, since we're setting this function as a value for onChanged now. We could add it here in front of input decoration. And inside of save title input, we can now use that input value, which is passed in automatically by Flutter whenever it calls this function, which, as mentioned, it does whenever the value in the text field changes. And we could now add a variable to our state here, entered title, or underscore entered title, which initially is an empty string, because initially nothing has been entered. But now here, whenever this is triggered, we can set underscore entered title equal to the entered input value. Like this. We don't need to wrap this with set state here, because I'm actually not using entered value anywhere in my UI code. So the UI doesn't need to update just because I'm storing the value entered by the user in some variable. Instead, I'm storing that value in some variable so that we can use that variable with that stored latest value entered by the user when the user submits the input. And for that, we need to add a button that allows the user to submit the input. So after the text field, still inside of the column, of course, I want to add my buttons. And for that, I'll add a row here, since I'll have more than one button eventually, which takes multiple child widgets, of course. And for the moment here, I'm only interested in adding one button here, an elevated button, let's say, on which we have to set the onPressed argument, pointing at a function that should be triggered when the button is pressed, and then the child widget that contains the content of the button. So for example here, a text that says save expense. And this text here can of course be a const value. And in onPressed, we now want to use this entered title to add a new expense. Now we'll do this eventually. At the moment, I'll simply print this entered title to see whether A, this code is executed, and B, we get access to that latest value that was entered. It should work because we're saving the latest value here on every keystroke in entered title, so therefore we should have the latest value entered by the user stored in that variable. And therefore, if we then, at a later point of time, reference this variable here, when this button is pressed, we should be able to print that latest entered value. So with that, if you save that and maybe force a reload, you should be able to enter some text here, like test, and click Save Expense. And if you now go back and you open this panel here in Visual Studio Code, and you dare go to the debug console, you should see this test value somewhere there, or whichever text you entered into your input field. So this works. We do have access to the entered title, and that's one way of getting hold of that value.